Hello friends, and welcome to the program. In 1988, I remember watching the PBS documentary, Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth. The documentary was originally broadcast as 6 one-hour conversations between mythologist Joseph Campbell and journalist Bill Moyers during the final 2 summers of Campbell's life. In these discussions, Campbell presents his ideas about comparative mythology and the ongoing role of myth in human society. I find the same creative spirituality alive and well in the works of John Knight Lundwall. I first discovered John's novel interpretation of mythology by watching his many riveting videos on YouTube, and not long ago discovered that he had written an absorbing and engaging new book on the nature of mythic consciousness called Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. Recently, he was kind enough to join us in our studios here on the coast of Northern California, where we had the following conversation. Good day, friends, and welcome to the studio. Today we're going to be joined by my friend John Lundwell, Dr. John Lundwell, who just wrote a brand new 350-page book called Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. John holds a doctorate degree in comparative myth and religious studies, and he's the chief editor of Cosmos and Logos, a journal of myth, religion, and folklore. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for coming to our studios. I've always been interested in mythology, and so I've read many, many books over the years in mythology. And I was very, very struck by your new book because you seem to be offering a really creative and very new understanding of myth. What was it exactly that was your intention? What did you want to accomplish by writing this work?
Well, look, this work is a result of several years of asking questions that interested me. When I was a teenager, I gave myself the challenge of reading all the religious texts of all the world's religions. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was too naive. You can only be naive to give yourself that challenge. But over the next 20, 30 years, I did that. And you don't have to read long before you encounter some very basic questions like, what am I reading? How does this doesn't even make sense. What is this? You read the Mahabharata, India's national epic, and it's full of strange characters, costumes, very mythic. And so as you start reading these religious texts, you get into reading myths. And I had several questions that I wanted to answer, and so you read theories of myths, theories of religion, and many of these theories were not answering my questions, and I wasn't agreeing with them anyway. So I decided to make my lifelong study official. I got a graduate degree in myth studies, comparative myth and religious traditions, and while searching for some very basic answers, I decided, well, there's not really a book that really answers what I'm looking for, so I'm going to have to write it. So that's what I did.
So there were many different theories of a myth that you read about, but there wasn't a particular theory of myth that captured your imagination.
Well, they all captured my imagination to a degree. When you study ancient myths, I mean, to be honest, when you read anthologies of myths, most of them come across to the Western literate mind as a bunch of gibberish, and many people treat them that way. And so when you study myth, you eventually have to do the only thing in order to decipher them. You have to study the theory of myth. Comparative myth studies is really studying theories of myth. And over the past 100 years, there's been very smart people, far smarter than I, spending their entire lives trying to tackle what do ancient mythologies mean, why were they created, where do they come from, and really, as I was reading through all these theories, I began realizing that these theories all had a priori assumptions. And I began kind of articulating, well, how did they form this theory and why did they form it? And after a while you realize, well, all these theories are products of present thinking, present theory, present ideology projected onto the past. Now, in many regards, that's unavoidable, right? The ancient oral world is gone, the ancient myth makers are gone, and the truth of the matter is ancient myth was not a text. So all we have are anthologies of myths written down. So already there's a problem because they were never text. They were sung, they were danced, they were ritualized, they were chanted, they involved cloth and mass and tattoos and festivals. All that's gone. And so really we just have to theorize how this comes to us. And so my particular approach is to put a new tweak, create a slightly different look, a new theory of ancient myth by looking at ancient cultures and ancient myths through the lens of oral thinking and its consequences, and especially oral cosmology and how that frames people's worldviews and how myths come out of that cosmology.
So in your opinion, perhaps not all ancient mythologies coming out of this, coming out of the oral tradition are cosmological, but most of them are cosmological. They're about the nature of the universe and understanding the human being's place in it then.
Well, yes. Look, ancient religion and ancient cosmology are synonymous. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to get into just exactly what cosmology is and how that relates. But all the gods and characters and heroes of ancient myths descend from metaphors. And Campbell calls them psychological metaphors. And there's a lot of truth to that. But they're rooted in cosmological, celestial ideas, celestial metaphors. So while a myth may actually be describing something very earthy and very terrestrial, many of the motifs descend from oral cosmology, their view of heaven and earth and how they relate. And so in that sense, there is a strong myth is saturated with cosmic themes, so much so that the stratas of myth descend from a particular way of looking at the universe, a way that we have forgotten, mm-hmm. a way that we have overwritten and called primitive oftentimes or silly, but it's actually a sophisticated metaphysics grown out of an oral world.
Well, that's very interesting. I found also in your introduction, you have this fascinating typology that you use about three underlying assumptions, you call it, that people have about the ancient past. You call them the Howlers, the Romantics, and the conspirators.
Yeah. Yes. Well, when you read books, both popular and academic, you come across three overarching historical views of history. And I did name them. The first is, I call them the Howlers. It sounds maybe like a pejorative term, but I get the term. In 1965, an astronomy professor named Gerald Hawkins wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded. He was from Boston University, and he was the first person to popularize the idea that the standing stones at Stonehenge were aligned to the rising and setting sun on solstice and equinox days. So he had a radical theory. These stones weren't just some lumps of rock. They were a sort of ancient computer that calculated celestial cycles. Well, he wasn't an archaeologist. He wasn't an anthropologist. He wasn't a historian. And mainstream academia destroyed this guy's theory. And the leading archaeologist in Britain, a man named Richard Atkins, wrote an article called Moonshine on Stonehenge, where he criticized Hawkins' work, and he said, look, we all know that Stonehenge was built by a bunch of howling barbarians, end quote. Well, it turns out Hawkins was right, and the mainstream academic community was wrong, simply because it did not enter into their paradigm that ancient peoples could build structures aligned to the rising and setting sun. Well, as it turns out, now that people are looking for these things, this whole new field of archaeoastronomy has been created. We find that the ancient megalithic world is full of these astral alignments, and structures and standing stones are not only aligned to the rising and setting sun, but they're aligned to the rising cycles of the moon, as well as specific stars in the sky. So this means that there is a detailed cosmology that underwrites the construction of these sites. And if it underwrites the construction of these sites, it's going to underwrite their religious constructs. And in an oral age, it's going to underwrite their myths.
So you would want to make the argument that part of the problem in the past with understanding of myth, how it functions, and its original intention coming out of oral culture was because of our own prejudice, that we just automatically assume that people who lived 1,000 years ago or 2,000 to 3,000 years ago were basically barbarians and idiots, and we're just so much more smarter than those people.
Well, you know, actually, that is a truth that probably goes back centuries. The present generation may always, well, actually in the mythic world, they were always looking back to the golden age. They thought the people in the past were much brighter than they were, and that they had lost something essential. But the howling point of view is very popular, and it is exactly what you just said. Everyone believes, everyone in the ancient past, or the people who ascribe to this, were primitive, less intelligent, less evolved, right? That the mind, the human mind, hadn't evolved to the sophistication of the modern mind. And it's easy to think this. You know, you go out on an archaeological dig and you dig up a bone and a piece of pottery, and you take out your iPhone and you take a picture of it and you say, these guys are idiots. Because you have an iPhone that's GPS to a satellite that was shot up there by a rocket, and you got a piece of pottery, right? So it's easy to assume this, but this is an illusion. What we're comparing is technologies. And as it turns out, it takes thousands of years to build up a knowledge base vertically in order to create a technology like an iPhone. But most importantly, it takes writing and literacy to build an iPhone. 99% of human history exists in orality, people who did not read or write. They were not illiterate, they were pre-literate. And there's some things you can't do without writing. You can't make an iPhone. But because you can't make an iPhone, we assume they just never had sophisticated thoughts enough to make an iPhone. And so when we find Stonehenge aligned to celestial movements, or the pyramids or the temples, this doesn't quite fit in our howling primitive conception. Let me just speak real quick on these other two historical points of view. I think, by the way, that the howling point of view is, in the words of a mathematician, Giulio Magli, a silly and sloppy hypothesis of history. People 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, were just as intelligent as people today, as you and I. They had the same hardware. They were operating off of different software, right? Orality has consequences, and literacy has consequences. So when you start detailing these, much of the ancient world, in my opinion, starts to make sense, and I write a lot about this in my book. The other historical point of view is what I call the Romantics. So the Howlers are people who believe that people in the ancient past are howling barbarians. They're primitive. They could only make pottery. And the Romantics are people who romanticize history by saying that everyone in the ancient past was spiritual, was connected with the landscape, was deeply in tune with the psyche and with the rhythms of the universe. Well, actually, there's some truth to that. However, when you look in the ancient past, you see human sacrifice, ritualized prostitution, deforestation of entire landscapes. Myths tend to be extremely violent. This is not a world where everyone's holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It is a gritty, hard world, like the world is today. So there's this romantic view that I think also misses the mark. And the romantic view is very popular. The howling view was popular all the way up until a few decades ago. Scholars have really started to make inroads on that. But now the romantic view has kind of replaced it. And the third, oh yes.
No. Well, I was just going to say, let me share with you a story here that I think is pertinent to what you're talking about. I spent a number of years, my wife and I, living out on the Navajo reservation, and I remember hearing a National Public Radio broadcast that they interviewed a Navajo code talker. You know, the Navajo people are very, very proud of the role that the code talkers played in World War II, and it was a very fascinating interview. This interviewer interviewed a code talker who had been in World War II, and he asked him, he said, well, it must have been very difficult to be a Native American in World War II. There must have been a lot of prejudice against you. And the gentleman said, oh, no, not at all. He said it was just the opposite, right? They thought that like every time that I shot the gun, I would hit a bullseye, right? and I was so shocked by this because, but you know, then I think a real truth dawned on me, right? That, oh, well, you know, this is what racism is, or thinking somebody that's less than, right? This is what racism is. You either think that somebody is less than you are, or you think that somebody's better than you are, right? But the one thing that they can't be is just like you, right? and so you say you see the same sort of prejudice spilling over into the field of mythology, right? That these people couldn't read and write, so obviously they were less than us. They were less intelligent than us. But your point is that intelligence has nothing to do with literacy.
No. Actually, the way we structure our thoughts actually structures the way we think. So literacy will change our capacities for thinking. And look, you know, we're in a studio here, we have TV cameras, that's all impossible without literacy. But intelligence is something different. In fact, I mean, a great definition of intelligence isn't book smart, it isn't degrees, it isn't this technology. A great definition of intelligence is the ability to solve problems, right? 50,000 years ago, there were a bunch of people who had some very basic problems. I'm hungry. I've got this huge woolly mammoth. There is no way I can take this thing down. But he looks delicious. So what do? Well, somewhere along the line, someone invents a stone axe. And again, we look at a stone axe and we look at a modern axe and we say, oh, these guys were primitive. But as it turns out, the design of an axe has not changed in the tens of thousands of years since the first one was invented. The design, the weight, the geometry of it, all that has changed is the materials that's made out of it, and we have access to better technologies. But the intelligence behind the invention of the original stone axe is no different than the intelligence behind the replication of that design using different materials. So the point is that, I mean, at some point someone invented writing. Who did that? Well, oral peoples had to do that.
Yeah.
How did they do that? If they were, writing is probably the greatest invention in the history of humanity. It makes space rockets look like small fry. Writing changes everything. Writing is a colossal task of intellectual endeavor. Whoever invented writing belongs with the Einsteins, the Galileos, the Keplers, the Archimedes of our civilization. Who did it? We have no idea. These are people at the very edge of history to which we owe everything and about which we know nothing.
Modern cosmology has been basically reduced to science and the instruments of science, the logic, the rationality of the scientific method. Right? So that when modern science looks at the microcosm, right, it sees rocks in motion, right?
Right.
Rocks in motion. And when it looks at the microcosm, it looks down a microscope. When it looks at the macrocosm, it looks up a telescope, right?
Right.
If this is what modern science has been reduced to, what is cosmology then in an oral culture? How is it different, and how does it function?
Well,
Because this is really, I think, at the heart of your work, and is really some of your most creative ideas are in when you try to explain what oral cosmology is about.
It is a very central piece of my work, and I have to tell you, it. You know, when I started studying religions and myths, and I find these interesting cosmic themes and motifs, you know, pretty soon you build this huge strata of motifs. You don't know what to do with it. None of the scholarly literature really is doing much with it. And so it's something I had to wrestle with. So let's start at some real basics. Cosmology is a big word. Cosmology is the study of the universe. And a modern definition of cosmology is it's our study of the origin and structure of the universe. And so here's the problem with that definition. All cosmologies are philosophies. All of them. All of them are, another big word, epistemologies. Epistemology is a word that means, how do we know what we know? Well, it turns out what we think of the universe is how we frame our cultural imagination. The most important story, the most important narrative you could ever tell a person is a cosmology. Because a cosmology will tell a person where they fit in the universe, where they fit in the big picture. And if your cosmology is rocks in motion and dirt, then where do I fit? The tension, the tension between the creationists, right, who are arguing, hey, we should be teaching the Bible in school, and between the secularists that say, no, we need to be teaching science, is really a tension not between science and religion. It's an argument of cosmologies. This group here still wants to find a valuable place in the cosmos. And they start that with the creation, with the cosmology, where the universe came from. It came from God. We cannot give that up. If we give that up, we are no longer an essential part of the cosmos. Well, actually, it turns out that these tensions have existed for centuries. when the Greeks were first articulating a geocentric cosmos, which was completely wrong, by the way, but when they were first articulating a geocentric cosmos, one Roman emperor said, well, this is very interesting, but I prefer to believe in the cosmos of the mysteries. And that cosmos was a cosmos where the human soul took center stage. So even back in classical Greece, we get this tension between competing cosmologies, between the science of the age, which at the time was geocentrism, and the mystery cults that taught that the human soul, the human psyche, was intimately connected with all cosmic functions. So look, cosmology is our understanding of the structure of the universe and our place in the universe. One thing it's nice to know, and again, Karl Popper points this out, all cosmologies are metaphysical. They're all philosophies of some sort. So we have Big Bang cosmology in our modern world. And lots of people are not going to be happy or agree with what I'm about to say, but the truth of the matter is the Big Bang cosmology, with all the other ones in the past and the ones that will be in the future, is a theory that begins in mid-sentence, right? It works after the singularity, where all the matter in the universe is supposed to be in this one particle, this one singularity. Once that's there, then there's this expansion, this explosion, and the universe is formed from it. Well, our theories begin to apply after the expansion starts, right? It doesn't say anything about the original singularity. That is a construct of pure faith. We can't prove it, we can't disprove it. We don't know where it came from, we don't know what it is, we don't know anything about it. And again, we can't even prove that it was there. We infer it was there because everything is expanding, and therefore we assume that everything must have been in one particle. But this is philosophy. This is metaphysics. This is something we can't disprove or prove. So again, I'm not denigrating it. I love studying scientific cosmology, modern cosmology. It's one of my passions. And astronomy, I'm an amateur astronomer. I love going out using my GPS telescope and looking at the stars. But it's important to know that modern cosmology is a philosophy, and one good way of comparing it to ancient oral cosmology is by talking about this idea of a macrocosm, microcosm. The macrocosm is the big space, right? Stars, sun, moon. The microcosm in modern science is actually the quantum particles, but in oral science, the microcosm was the human soul, which was a reflection of the bigger cycles around him or her. So we have this idea that in ancient oral societies, they were so simple-minded that they created this geocentric universe, right? Because you walk out, you stand on the ground, you look at the horizon, everything is, the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, and it goes around, and the stars are moving, and it's all around the earth, and therefore, the universe must be geocentric. The earth's in the center, and the universe is all around it. First off, that isn't oral cosmology. That's Greek cosmology. Pre-Greek cosmology is actually uncertain because it was oral. This should be rather obvious. But if it's oral, it doesn't get passed down to us. And what we do read is written centuries later by people often criticizing the oral constructs. So our view of oral cosmology is already difficult. So is that what they really believed? And I bring in several examples in my book which says the picture is much more complex. Because in oral cosmology, there is no separation between heaven and earth. The flat earth of myth actually was the extension of the celestial equator into space, measuring the solstices and equinoxes. In other words, a lot of flat earths and myths are square. Well, so we think, oh, these childlike minds, they have this simple square notion of an earth. Well, that's actually an experiential take on the earth and space. You go out and you measure north, south, east, west, there's your square earth. But then the sun rises and sets in different spots on the horizon, and it'll rise north and stop at the summer solstice at its far north extreme. Then it'll start rising south and stop at the winter solstice as its far southern extreme. And right in the middle are the days of equinox. More importantly, as it's rising on different spots on the horizon, on summer solstice, there'll be a group of stars that meet it. And on winter solstice, there'll be a different group. And at equinox, vernal and spring equinox, there'll be different groups. So they understood that as all these celestial bodies moved, there was a synthesis of what was going on. And the flat square earth therefore becomes the stars meeting the sun on the days of equinox and solstice, right? Or north, south, east, west. It's not a childlike, simple way of saying, well, we can't figure anything out, so the earth is square. It's an experiential, hey, look at what the sun does. Look, it's meeting different stars. These stars are actually opposed to each other to the sky. This forms our square earth, right? More importantly, so this is one way of putting it, modern cosmology has discovered this heliocentric system. Hey, the planets actually don't orbit the Earth, they orbit the sun. And this changed everything, right? The birth of heliocentrism was part of a scientific revolution. It transformed society. Well, we discovered the heliocentric system of the macrocosm, the big space. We turned the microcosm, or the role of man in the cosmos, into a geocentric system. In other words, anthropocosmos, man from the heavens, man from the star world, man who is, or woman who is destined to return to the star world, turned into anthropergamentum, man as dirt. So in oral cosmology, you have this geocentric cosmos, but the soul is heliocentric in that it can join with the sun and stars and ascend through the heavens to arrive at the realm of the infinite, the eternal. In much of ancient cosmology, so we would call it religion, but much of ancient cosmology is this idea that the soul is eternal and it comes from the star world. And we are here to repeat, to live in harmony with the star world so that we can return to it.
It's such a fascinating idea, this notion of the human beings coming from the stars, because you speak of that in terms of ancient Greek and Egyptian thought, but I was adopted into a sub-tribe of the Lakota Sioux people, and I'm the firekeeper for my family's Sundance ceremony. And every Sundance, when I'm there in the middle of South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation, looking at the beautiful heavenly stars, I hear the stories that my family tells that they originated, the Lakota people came from the stars, and that when they pass from this life, that they journey through the Milky Way back to eternal life. And that idea that's being expressed in the middle of this country, at summer solstice, in the Lakota culture, is still the same story that was told of this celestial ascent back into eternal life that's thousands and thousands of years old.
It's beautiful.
It is.
It's stunning.
It's a beautiful story, and you can see there the power of that. The power of those notions is because we have a place now in the world. We are related to the stars. We are related to the earth. We are related to one another. And we are all part of this. One of the primal religious notions of the Navajo people is the notion that they call hojo. And that means a harmony, beautiful. Harmony and beauty, in many of their prayers. We live in beauty, beauty behind me, beauty in front of me. That there is a beauty and a harmony that is expressed if one has eyes to see, if one truly wants to live in accordance with this way. There is a great power given to one, and that power has to do with living in the knowledge of eternal life, that we are not simply these beings of clay. We can relate to our form, to our material bodies, but there is we are star beings. There is in us this consciousness that is our origin, from which we came, and that when we leave this world, we shut the radio off and we return back to beauty, and we return back to the harmony of the divine light. And that's a very powerful way to live. That's a very powerful epistemology. And why can't that inform us equally, if not more, than a modern scientific cosmology? We are the ones, you're saying, that make those sort of what you call epistemological judgments about.
That is correct.
That we say, no, it's only science that's going to inform us as to the nature of reality, not the beauty of the night sky.
But the point is, science is still speculating. Science can offer only honest silence when it comes to subjects of the soul. So, oral cosmology placed the soul in the center of the cosmos. And, we can laugh and smirk at it, but you can't prove or disprove it. And in modern scientific vision, you can't prove or disprove the non-existence of the soul. So oral cosmology explained the universe to the community, and it helped them participate. There's an old Greek philosopher who says, we are eternal souls carrying around a corpse. Right? This body is just a temporary moving of rocks. But our essence is eternal, and it will return to the eternal.
I recently lost my sister, Tilly Blackbear, and I remember Tilly used to tell me, she'd say, Lynn, she says, and she was a powerful Lakota woman. She started the first battered women's shelter on a Indian reservation many 40 years ago, something like that. And my sister used to tell me, especially at the end of her life, she'd say, Lynn, we are spirits on an earthly journey. I mean, don't we feel that way sometimes? We really feel that way, right? Even in the midst of this material culture, even in the midst of, like you say, how our bishops now wear lab coats, right?
Right.
They postulate a cosmos from which we are abstracted from. We are no longer really part of this divine cosmic vision,
right,
coming out of this oral cosmology. And we really need to be reminded, as my sister reminded me, that we truly are spirits on this earthly journey. And I really thank you for writing this book. And I thank you for this heroic, really, in my opinion, this heroic endeavor that you took to look one more time as to what the nature of religion is, to look one more time as to what these ancient stories can tell us. And I really appreciate your friendship, and I appreciate you coming here to speak with us
Thank you.
today.